Hello guys, and welcome back to Reading Club. So today I'm going to read you Daisy and the Trouble with Vampires, Chapter 13 and Chapter 14. Chapter 13. Once I got used to being dressed up in a Halloween costume, I actually started to feel okay about going to see Mrs. Pike. I looked really good. In an emergency, I could get changed really quickly, and who knows, doing Halloween things with Mrs. Pike might not be so bad after all. Trouble is, when I opened my front door at 4 o'clock and looked out into the street, it wasn't just getting dark, it was getting foggy too. Really foggy. The trouble with fog is it makes everything look really ghostly. Do you want me to come with you to knock on Mrs. Pike's door? Asked Mom. Yes, please, I gulped. The trouble with stepping out of your house into a front garden that's filling up with Halloween fog is it feels like ghosts are creeping all around you and touching your face with cold, wispy fingers. Things got even creepier when we got to Mrs. Pike's garden gate. Because do you know it was lined up along her drive all the way to her front door? You'll never believe it. Not one scary pumpkin, but 10, with lit up candles inside them too. I couldn't tell if the pumpkins were haunted ones or not, but you should have seen their teeth. They were like sharks. Where do you think Mrs. Pike is going to take me in the car? I asked. She's asked me not to tell you, said Mom, but I promise you it'll be fun. By the time we got to Mrs. Pike's front doorstep, all I wanted to do was go home. Because do you know what was dangling from the door knocker? A great, big, hairy spider. There was no way I was going to knock on a door knocker like that. Trouble is, my mom did the knocking instead. When the front door opened and Mrs. Pike looked at me, I nearly wet myself. I wasn't even sure I was looking at Mrs. Pike. Because instead of wearing Mrs. Pike type clothes, the person in front of me had a long red dress on, a black silky cape, green pointy shoes, and hair that didn't look like Mrs. Pike at all. And you should have seen her face. It wasn't Mrs. Pike color in the slightest. It was whiter than the fog. Well, most of it was. Her eyes were purple, and her chin had been dribbled on with red blood. Didn't you know Mrs. Pike was a vampire, Daisy? Mom smiled. Have a lovely time together, won't you? I'm off to make some trifle. When Mom turned round and left me alone on the doorstep with an actual vampire, I couldn't believe it. When Mrs. Pike said, "Welcome to my house of horror, Daisy," I nearly fainted because do you know what else I saw when she smiled? White, pointy vampire teeth. The trouble with fainting is it makes it really easy for a vampire to suck all your blood out because you can't put up a struggle. So I had to not faint and go into her house instead. Mrs. Pike's hallway was the creepiest hallway I'd ever seen. There were cobwebs all over the walls. There were more dancing pumpkins going up the stairs. There were more giant spiders hanging from a lampshade. There was even a right way up bat dangling from the handle of the kitchen door. Would you like some fizzy blood, Daisy? Said Mrs. Pike. It tastes just like cherryade. The trouble with fizzy blood is I had never drunk fizzy blood before. It wasn't the fizzy I didn't fancy, it was the blood. When I asked Mrs. Pike if she had orange squash instead, she told me to follow her into the kitchen. So I did, because I had to, because if a vampire tells you to do something, you have to do it, or she might bite you. I don't have any orange squash, Daisy, said Mrs. Pike, taking a plastic bottle out of her cupboard. But I do have this. It looks and tastes like orange squash, but actually it's goblin juice. I'm telling you, if I could have turned myself into a vampire bat and flown straight out of the kitchen window, I definitely would have. But I couldn't, so I didn't. And anyway, the kitchen window was closed. There you are, Daisy, said Mrs. Pike, pouring me a glass of goblin juice and herself a glass of fizzy blood. Thank you so much for coming to see me this afternoon. And may I just say a very happy Halloween to us both. Chapter 14. Once I was absolutely sure Mrs. Pike wasn't going to suck all my blood out, I started to relax. In fact, I even tried the fizzy blood, too. And guess what? It tasted exactly like Cherryade. Mrs. Pike said she always had fizzy blood to drink on Halloween night when she was my age. The fizziest thing I had ever had on Halloween night before was milk. Do you think I could do a pumpkin? I asked. I've never done a pumpkin before. Of course you can, Daisy, said Mrs. Pike. I just need to fetch it in from the garden. When Mrs. Pike came back in, she was carrying the biggest pumpkin I had ever seen. I saved the best one for you, she said, lowering it down onto the kitchen table. The trouble with lowering a pumpkin down onto a kitchen table is it makes you realize how big a pumpkin can be. The pumpkin Mrs. Pike had given me to carve was ginormous, but the goo inside was even better. The trouble with goo is I'm not allowed to have goo at home in case I get too gooey. But once we cut a star shape in the top of the pumpkin and lifted it off, Mrs. Pike let me put my hand right inside. The goo inside a pumpkin is immense because not only is it all squidgy and cold, it is full of millions and millions of slimy seeds. The more I sloshed my hand around, the more the goo and the slime and the seeds slithered and slimed around my fingers. To be honest, I'd have been quite happy just squishing and squashing and squidging goo around with my hands. But Mrs. Pike said that we had to get all the goo out of the pumpkin before we could start doing the carving. The trouble with getting pumpkin goo out is it doesn't all come out at once. Some of it you can't scoop out with your hands. The rest of it you have to scrape out with a big spoon because the edges of the inside of a pumpkin are a bit stringy. Because it was such a big pumpkin, we decided I would get all the goo I could out with my hands, and Mrs. Pike would do the rest with a spoon. You should have seen how full our goo bowl was when we finished. After we'd rinsed and dried our hands, Mrs. Pike said we were ready to start carving. The trouble with carving is you haven't done it before. If you haven't done it before, then it's best if you let a vampire show you how first. Especially if you're using a pumpkin carver that is really sharp. Mrs. Pike's pumpkin carver was the business. It had an orange plastic handle and a really thin, crinkly blade. Okay, Daisy, she said. The first thing we need to do is decide which side of the pumpkin we want the face to be. And then we need to cut out the first eye. Cutting out pumpkin eyes is really tricky. First, you have to work out where the very top of the first eye is going to be. Then you have to push the crinkly bit of the carver right through the pumpkin skin in the exactly right spot. Now we start carving, said Mrs. Pike, using the pumpkin carver like a saw to cut out a triangle shape. Mrs. Pike was an expert. Her triangle shape was brilliant, not too big and not too small. Plus, when she pressed it out with her thumb, the hole that was left behind looked exactly like a scary pumpkin eye. Right, Daisy, she said, handing me the pumpkin carver. Your turn. When I held the pumpkin carver for the first time, I felt a bit nervous. But guess what? I was an expert too. Finished, I said once I'd done all of the face and everything. Daisy, that's brilliant, said Mrs. Pike. That's absolutely amazing. Only, where are the teeth? I don't want him to have teeth, I told her. I just want him to have eyes and a nose. But why don't you want him to have a mouth? Asked Mrs. Pike. You don't want to know, I said. After we cleared all the pumpkin things away and had another drink of fizzy blood, Mrs. Pike took the lid of the pumpkin I carved, put a handle inside, and lit it. You should have seen how orange and flickery the eyes and nose looked then. It was brilliant. It looked even better with the kitchen lights off. Would you like me to tell you some scary stories, Daisy? Mrs. Pike asked. No, thank you, I said. Would you like me to put some makeup on you and turn you into a vampire, just like me? She asked. No, thank you, I said. Would you like me to... No, thank you, I said. Can we just have some more fizzy blood and then maybe talk about nice things instead? Right you are, said Mrs. Pike. I'll open another bottle. Once we drank another bottle of fizzy blood and I'd finished telling Mrs. Pike all about me, we suddenly realized how late it was. Goodness me, Mrs. Pike said, looking at her watch. Is that the time already? What time is it? I asked, poking my tongue out to try and see if my tongue had gone red. It's trick-or-treating time, she said, clapping her hands. So that's the end of this channel. I hope you enjoyed my readings of it, and if you did, please click many likes and subscribe Reading Club. I'll come back later with a new and improved channel. Bye, everybody!